I'm Inge Teblick. Today I'll be telling you a few things about horses that you might have known, but I dare say that some stuff you probably didn't know yet. It's what I call my appetizer lecture, because it gives a short overview of all these amazing things that a little bit of interest in science can teach you about how horses are and how they learn and how that influences and hopefully even changes some things you do to them. And the really interesting thing is that what we think is common sense that every decent horse person knows for a fact actually often is contradicted by the facts. The fact of how horses actually are or how they learn. There are so many misunderstandings between humans and horses based on hearsay that it's a wonder horses keep on doing what we expect them to do, at least most of the time. That in itself is really telling about how friendly and willing horses are and why people can get away with sometimes horrible handling. Just imagine a cat or a bunny from 500 kilos and do to them what we do to our horses.
What you see here is the cover of my Dutch book, which goes into all this in more detail. It's called Denkwerk, which is a bit untranslatable, but it means like work your mind. But it also means that it's your horse's brain you train, much more than you think, in different ways. And in this lecture, we'll explore a few of these different ways. It's not just your riding aid or the food you give that makes your horse do what he does. Here you see a few of the influences that all play along when you simply ask your horse to get on the trailer or go into trot. Half of the influences, the top half, is about influences from the outside, things in the environment, like you and other horses. The bottom half is about influences that come from the horse himself. And of every of these fields, I'll be picking some random stuff that we think about our horses, and which might not be true. Well, I say we, because I do hope that most of this is common knowledge, and that it just freshens up some things you do know. But when you just started diving into a more holistic approach towards training horses, some of these things might be completely new to you. The first field, which sits at the edge between outside and inside influences, is ethology. Ethology is a scientific field about how horses are when they just can be horses and have all the space they wish for. What would your horse do if he could pick the life he wanted? Ethology is about how horses behave in the wild. In your pasture or your stall lives a wild horse. Horses exist for 55 million years, while humans only exist for 200,000 years. That means that if a horse exists for the length of a 40-meter or 132 feet arena, humans only discovered that they could ride horses half a centimeter ago, which is about 0.2 inches. You can't simply ignore that difference between the horse on the inside and the one you put a saddle on. Sometimes you hear someone say how disappointed she is in her horse. He doesn't jump like she thought he would, or like his papers promised. Or he might just not get the dressage prizes he was bought for. Or he turns out not to be a real family horse, meaning kids can do whatever they want and he won't retaliate in some way or another. So he gets sold to the next family. He's being torn away from his small world where he knows everything so well, from his small herd if he's so lucky to have one, or even from his mother at a few months old. In reality, horses aren't that different from humans. Horses are born in small families of on average 5 horses large. Colts go to bachelor groups somewhere around 3 years old. Fillies might stay a bit longer and move to a different family group with the stallion. And normally from then on they stay in their new family for the rest of their life. Family is really important to them, and yes, to answer that frequently asked question, horses do know each other back, even years after they haven't seen each other. What's a real good barn to put your horse in? One of the qualities a barn might advertise with is on how many times they feed the horses. They'll feed 2 packets of hay at 9 in the morning, accompanied by 2 kilo of industrial pellets, and again at 5 in the evening. Maybe your horse will be put on straw, but it's also possible he might be put on shavings or flaxen because that looks better. But what does that do to your horse? Your horse is built for grazing 16 hours a day, small bit by small bit, step by step. He has a very small stomach, which only serves to start the digestive cycle by soaking the food in gastric acid. The real digestion will happen in his intestines for the next 72 hours. Food doesn't stay in the stomach, it just passes there all the time, so the gastric acid is released constantly. Unlike with humans, where the stomach only releases acid when food drops in it, and where the stomach does lots of work already. Locked in a box, your horse gets all the food at once, but in between nothing. It overfills his stomach, clumps up his intestines, and on top of that he gets ulcers, not just from the stress of having nothing to do in that box, but also from 22 hours of useless gastric acid. When I was a kid, everyone told me how much work it was to have a horse, because you have to go to the barn every day and at least once a day let him out of his box. And indeed what I saw and still see is people who let their horse out of the box and chase him around without any muscle warm-up for 15 minutes. If his human has more time, he'll get more interest, yet he can't move where or when he wants because he needs to be brushed and saddled. And then they get on him and he can't move where he wants either, until he's shoved back in the garage. In reality, horses live a moving life. They are true nomads, roaming 25 to 80 kilometers a day or 15 to 50 miles, day and night. They do try to get that mileage in their box as well, so they'll turn and fiddle and move. And some of them will even feel so deprived of natural movement possibilities that they'll start weaving. Others will forget how it was to move and stand dozing all along. If humans would do that, they'd get Prozac against depression. I once was called by the neighbors to my pasture to tell me that one of my horses was lying down. They believe that horses never lie down, and I think some horse owners think that too. Hey, you can even buy anti-cast surcingles. But your horse needs to lie down. True, they need a lot less sleep than we do, and they sleep in short bursts spread over day and night, but they only can get in deep sleep and dream if they can lie down. Now I don't know what horses dream about, but when humans are deprived of dreaming, they get cribby. So if your horse gets cast a lot in his stall, remove the stall, but not the sleep. Every time you talk to a competition rider about letting horses run free in pastures most of the day, they'll say something like that he'll hurt himself and he's not used to that and the other horses will kick him. Well, it's all true, but it happens exactly because you don't let your horse run free. Because he's not used to uneven footage and talk horse and deal with horse things as a responsible horse adult. But also, it's simply the wrong thing to do if you want that best competition horse. And I'm not inventing this. Research after research after research confirms this. Horses who live outside in groups move better, learn faster, and stay fitter than horses in boxes. What's the most hurt excuse for hitting your horse? Yeah, this one. Look at what they do to each other in the pasture. True, things can be pretty rough, but only when horses aren't allowed to settle in permanent relationships. So if you want to use that excuse, let's go see what they really do in that pasture. Out of 24 hours, they'll be grazing for 14 to 16 hours. They'll stand around for 3 or 4 hours or so. They'll spend 3 hours lying down, enjoying the sun or, yes, in deep sleep. That leaves us with about 3 hours of social interaction, like playing and grooming each other. Of those 3 hours, maximum 10% of that, which is like 15 minutes a day tops, this will be antagonistic, which means variable degrees of grumpiness and move out of the way behavior with flattened ears or a head swing. And of that 15 minutes, they'll like never hit each other. So if you really want to train your horse the way they treat each other, that means you reward with food 80% of the time. And you make physical contact to tell him that yes, he has to do it right now, like maybe twice a year. Perception is about how a horse sees, hears and feels his world. This explains so much misunderstandings that just knowing these little facts will already cause daily changes in your interaction with your horse. So your horse spooks, but you haven't seen or heard anything. He's just testing you, people tell you. But it's not because you didn't hear anything that he didn't. Horses hear less low sounds, but they hear way higher frequencies than humans do. Yeah, they hear bats. And on top of that, they hear more variety in what they hear. A mare will recognize a foal whinnying at a distance of up to 5 kilometers or 3 miles away. So your horse doesn't do what you want, but you need it done right now, like standing still for an injection or the fire. And you fix your lack of training with a twitch. So why would that work, a twitch? It can't really hurt, right? Because it magically goes into something that looks like a half-sleeping stance. Or another explanation you might have heard is that the twitch diverts his attention. Well, it sure diverts his attention. In fact, of all the body parts, most nerve endings are in a horse's lips, and his lips are now in so much pain that his body thinks it's dying, and it goes in acute survival mode. His brain releases so much endorphins, the body's own natural painkiller, that he even gets drowsy from it. Earlier today I drove past the pasture, and to my astonishment I saw horses with drugs on them already. Okay, it's October right now, but it's 18 degrees Celsius or 64 Fahrenheit. But people get cold and want a coat, so they think their horse needs a coat too. But he already has a wonderful coat that works better than the fanciest sports brand. In fact, he doesn't need a rug in a long time. His thermo comfort zone, which is the temperatures in between he doesn't get too hot or too cold, is between 0 and 25 degrees Celsius. Rain will never touch his skin, because it will be guided off his body by his erect fur. Same for snow, which will stay shiny white on his back, not being melted by his body heat, because that long hairy winter coat between his body and that snow is the perfect insulation. But I ride competition, you say, and that's not healthy. Well, two things aren't healthy in those circumstances. That judges and juries detract points for horses who look natural, but also that you don't want to take as much time for walking him down as you wanted to do for warming him up. It's a stubborn horse and he won't go in the trailer. Or it might be that he always balks before entering the stall doorways. Or from inside the stall, outside in the sun. Well, we do know that horses are claustrophobic, that they don't like being limited in their constant scannings for predators. But what you maybe didn't know and could be of more importance in these kinds of behaviors is that a horse simply sees changes in light intensity very different from us. Horses' eyes adjust a lot slower to light intensity than our eyes. When we go from light to dark, we already have to wait a bit before we can see more. Well, with horses that takes a much longer time. So you really ask a horse to just follow you blindly into that dark hole or bright white light. The same goes for acuity adjustments, which means that the horse might see things like jumping obstacles sharp at a distance, but they are blurry by the time he gets there. On top of that, horses are dichromats. They see red as green, so their world mostly is a yellowish green where only blue really jumps out. We have round pupils, but horses have narrow, flat pupils. Sure, they can see almost all around, but that panoramic view actually is very limited at the top and at the bottom. It's as if you would look through narrow glasses. You have to move your head up and down to actually get something within that visual streak, and that is exactly what horses do when they throw up their head to get a look at the next obstacle, because once they are near and have to sail over, they just don't see it anymore. It also explains why young horses have trouble staying stable in the rider's hands when they come out of the circle near to the wall again. It's not just that they still need to build the physical ability to carry their rider in a balanced way through corners, but it's also a matter of limited vision. They know the wall is there, but they can't really see it because it's not in their visual streak. That gets even worse when a dressage rider would want to ride his horse low, deep and round, or not just dressage riders, reining riders as well. That really is blind obedience, because the horse has no clue where he's going. Just like you wouldn't when someone would ask you to keep going, but all you can look at is your toes. These last years there's a lot more interest in knowing how a horse moves. We still learn new things with every research that gets published. Quite astonishing actually that this still is a young science topic. One of the things that I keep wondering about is how still not everyone knows that there are no muscles below a horse's knees. It's the contraction of the hoof that makes the blood circulate in a horse's lower legs, not muscles. All the more reason to really think about whether you really need those irons on those hooves, because irons limit those contractions. A horse movement doesn't start here. A horse's stride comes half from his backhand and belly muscles. Those muscles pull the leg up and forward in the air, and that's it. Then they just let go of the leg so it falls on the ground. It's simply the impact of that fall that makes the leg bounce up again, so that the muscles can pick that movement halfway up again and pull it a bit forward again. This sustainable energy system works best on hard, grassy undergrounds. If the sand is too deep, the bounce back is deadened, and the muscles have to take over all the work. This also has consequences for the timing of your riding aids. You have to give a riding aid when the horse's leg is pulled up in the air and before it's released to the ground, because then it's too late. So if your horse responds sluggishly to your riding aids, it might simply be because you're giving them just a bit too late, and he can't pick up his leg again in time to move it faster or somewhere else. What you might not know is what you actually sit on when you ride. Yes, the fleshy part is the long back muscle, but that's not the muscle that keeps you up in the air. That muscle merely serves to let the movement from the backhand travel through under you to the forehand. You don't sit on the horse's spine either. Those knobs you see is not your horse's spine. What you see are the top ends of the vertebrae. Horse's vertebrae look different than human vertebrae, especially at the withers. The withers are formed by dorsal spinal processes which can be up to 30 centimeters or 12 inches long. You can also see how badly these are arranged, or no, I have to correct that. They are wonderfully arranged, because when a horse moves his head down to graze, those spinal processes are pulled away from each other. But when a rider goes sit on the back and weighs the back and the horse throws up his head, that's when the spinal processes move towards each other and even can touch each other, which is very, very painful. It's called kissing spine. The real champions in your horse's backs are the ligaments. There are actually two back ligaments, one which is more on top and one which sits lower inside. The long supraspinous ligament is pulled up when the nuchal ligament at the neck pulls it forward. So actually, the rider is carried by the forward outward dropping of a horse's head. So the back of the neck moves up when it's done correctly. People know more or less about this connection between head and back. That's why they try to pull the horse's chin towards his neck. But that actually works counterproductive, because for doing that the horse has to use his underneck muscle, which also connects to a pectoral muscle lower down, which in turn again connects to the forelegs. Through that connection, pulling the chin actually pulls the horse's forelegs up instead of forward. The horse starts to move in short, choppy steps rather than swinging forward. Unfortunately, this is what you often see trained, and you don't need to be a harsh competition rider to do that. I've seen it done at Liberty by clicker trainees as well, clicking their horses for chin position rather than for hind leg movement, which makes the horse's neck lift rather than curl. Neuroscience has made amazing strides forward in our knowledge about how we all function. One of the most important things that comes out from the latest research is that animals are much more alike to us than we ever thought before. This is a horse's brain. Now someone might have told you that a horse's brain is very small, but in reality it's not that small. It's about the size of an orange, and that's about 3/4 of a human brain. Human brains, however, have much more foldings and further developed areas than horses have, but there are also parts of the brain where horses do better than we do. This green part is the medulla, and it's a part of the brain that all animals have in common. It connects the brain with the spine, and from there with all the rest of the body. But what also sits here is basic consciousness, and that's something we don't know that long yet, because what this means is that all animals are conscious. This big blue part at the back of the horse's brain is the cerebellum, the center of movement, and it's comparatively larger in a horse than in a human. Horse brains are wired for movement, and it shows in the way horses learn. For instance, they learn abstract connections better when they can move at the same time, and they are also better at getting in information about their environment while they move, something humans have more problems with. All information passes here first. This red banana is the hippocampus, which is very important for memory. It gets in all the info from the outside and cuts it in smaller pieces of information, which then are all stacked at different places in the brain. In humans, for instance, when you go eat out, your brain will stack where it was and who was there and what was said, all in different places. And when you think back of that dinner later on, it'll retrieve all those smaller parts and glue it back together again, so it's one whole memory again. Horses' brains do that much less, and more in particular, they don't cut where something happened from what the horse was doing there, not in the same way as a human brain does. For a horse, the place where you ask him to canter and the canter itself is one event, so he stores it as one event. That's why your horse will want to canter every time in that same corner again. He didn't learn to respond to your canter aids, he learned to respond to the canter aids and the corner. It's you who will have to make sure that he cuts the place from the motion by asking him to canter in different spots. This also explains why things can go great at home and less so at a competition or a demo. It's not just nerves or being distracted. It's also that he doesn't know yet that he can do the same things in a different location as well. That small orange circle is the amygdala. It's actually a curled structure. Things that are fearful go straight here and are stored as a memory without passing through the hippocampus first, and they also get retrieved faster than any other memory. That's why a horse will spook before he knows what he's spooking about. By the way, it works just the same for you. If someone shouts boo behind your back, your body will jump a meter high before you realize someone was shouting boo behind your back. The big orange thing there is the corpus callosum. It connects the two brain halves from the horse. So if someone tells you that the horse uses one half of the brain and not the other, or that the horse has to learn the same thing once for the left brain half and once for the other brain half, tell him to go Google brain circuits. The horse uses all of his brain all the time. It's true that some specialized areas sit at the left and not at the right, or the other way around. But to do something, many areas in the brain work together, and those areas can be anywhere in the brain, and most sit in both halves of the brain. For instance, I talked about the amygdala, but there are actually two amygdalas. What is true though is that the right half of the brain takes care of the left half of the body and the other way around. But brains are amazing creations of evolution, and all animals use all their brain all the time. Okay, so a horse is a brain, but how smart is he? What can he actually learn? What is he good at and what can't he learn? People think the weirdest things about horses, and though it's certain that they think differently, they surely aren't dumb. And we should really care about saying that a different intelligence than ours would be equal to being dumb. The truth about horses is that horses are exactly as intelligent as horses should be to be a successful horse in his circumstances. The thing is, our domesticated circumstances are not his normal circumstances. About everything we ask from a horse is contradictory to what every sensible horse would do in the wild, like do not spook ever, and ignore every possible sign of a predator. Keep trotting in endless circles inside an arena going nowhere, and go over the obstacle instead of going around it. Horses have a phenomenal capacity for remembering things a long time. Unfortunately for us, they also remember the things that aren't useful for us. And they also remember things differently than us. I already told you about how horses don't cut up memories in the same small parts like we do, but that's not because they would be less developed in that area than we do. In fact, their super strong visual memory helps wild horses navigate through terrain where they might have been only once before. They just remember it. That's why horses can find a way back even when they forget their rider on a trail ride, even on trails where they've just been once before. Horses can make amazingly strong cognitive maps in their heads. Humans, however, have to take expensive courses to learn to remember better by making cognitive maps. The downside, however, is that when something in that cognitive map suddenly changes, they've seen it and they don't like it. They build their nomadic habits on where everything is, so they are hardwired to be alarmed by sudden changes. Not being able to deal very well with sudden changes includes lacking good object permanence. That means that they do know your wheelbarrow for 20 years or so, but when it's upside down, they don't recognize it anymore as your wheelbarrow. This possibly also means that a person on a horse could be a new entity for a horse, rather than what we know as that this is the same person from underground, who now sits upon that same horse. When things go right, it's usually due to our own amazing capabilities of being awesome. When things go wrong, it's of course the horse. And surely you too have heard those instructors yelling that your horse misbehaves on purpose, to test you. For instance, to test you if you truly are worthy to be his almighty leader or other mumbo-jumbo or so. Alas, it's very unlikely that a horse can plan for the future. He simply does not have the required advanced episodic memory capabilities. The ability to imagine yourself and what you do, both in the past and in the future, is what scientists refer to as mental time travel. Sure, the roots for planning are there, as in understanding if-then consequences. For instance, a horse can learn that if he fiddles with the gate he'll get out. But that's associative learning, and that's different from actually planning to get up in the morning and think, let's see what we can do today to have a good laugh at my human, which is mental time travel. A horse cannot lie. A horse cannot pretend. He acts like he feels. Doing differently requires an advanced form of theory of mind, which is the insight that someone else can have a different line of thinking than you do. What horses do have is all basic emotions. These emotions are very old, and all mammals have them in some form or another. These emotions may not be as complicated as ours, but horses of course do feel joy when playing, for instance. These basic emotions drive his intrinsic motivations. If your horse doesn't do what you want, it might be that, aside from possible physical problems and so on, this is because your controlling urges clash with his autonomous intrinsic motivations. Social learning is about what horses learn from each other. It's about how they behave to each other, and how they transfer that when they behave around you. Some of the most stubborn myths come from this area. One of those things that people talk about all the time is how you have to learn horse language. But in fact, it's not horse language that we base our training on. It's all these learning theories, including social learning, and the fact that all mammals, and to a certain extent all vertebrates, share the same universal language. We don't share those same basics with insects, for instance. What's more, we all have, and horses as well, a small part in the brain that says, "not my kind." Horses know we are not horses, just like we know we aren't horses. One of the most indestructible myths is also the most heard excuse for when a horse doesn't do what you want. That horses are all about dominance, as if the only thing that they think is, "this town ain't big enough for the both of us, and that only one can be the boss." In reality, there's no such thing as a horse hierarchy. Sure, there's some sort of ranking, but always only between two, not in a direct, straightforward top-to-bottom line, and it changes all the time, and is different for eating or drinking or moving. Now all horses are born with the knowledge of how to move dominantly or submissively. Such knowledge is called a fixed action pattern, but they still have to learn from other horses when they can behave dominant or submissive. It'll depend on what they can get away with. So there's no such thing as a dominant horse, there's only dominant behavior. If your horse acts dominant towards you, it's because he got away with it. It's up to you to change your behavior and explain to him that there are other ways to gain your cooperation. In fact, training can happen completely outside of these dominance fables. You can train goldfish, and I've never heard that a goldfish will only swim through a hoop because you behaved like the dominant goldfish. So it's time to clean up your horse vocabulary and throw out all these old-fashioned excuses for what really is merely inadequate training. Now we shouldn't underestimate the social learning capabilities of horses, but we shouldn't overestimate them either. The idea that you just have to show your horse something and he knows how to do it too, unfortunately won't happen. What horses and humans do have in common is social facilitation. When you start staring at something, your horse will start staring there too. When you run in panic, your horse will flee too. But observational learning is quite something else. It means that the horse knows what you're doing there and the purpose of it, and he'll replicate that in his mind to apply it later himself. There's no research that shows that the horse can actually do that. Something does happen in the sense that the horse shows tendencies to be interested in what you were doing there, and maybe see if something actually happens there, if he does something there too, but it doesn't seem like he knows what it really was about. Habituation is a learning form which is really underestimated in horse training. We take so much for granted. We leave so much to the horse to figure out all by himself, that often we have no clue what to do about it when he doesn't. For instance, your horse may be in a pasture where every hour a train passes by. He might have run when that happened the first time, but now he doesn't do it for a long time already anymore. But when you get at the train crossing when you ride him, all hell goes loose. Well, the horse simply got used to the train passing in his pasture, but not with you on your back. And that's because with you on his back, and on this location, habituation didn't happen yet. Your horse learned that running or bucking or standing still didn't change the behavior of the train. He can't do anything about that train, but it doesn't seem to be harmful. It just happens anyway, so he stopped reacting to it. A horse habituates to things that aren't worth putting energy in. That way he keeps his energy ready for something that's really dangerous or interesting. Things that don't have consequences get ignored. So when you keep bumping your heels in your horse's sides but he doesn't get better from responding to it, meaning you go on bumping no matter what he does, his body starts ignoring it. It's the same learning process that makes horses used to rain and wind on a clattering metal roof, or the weight of the saddle, or the metal in his mouth. The opposite of habituation is sensitization. You can make your horse attentive to things that happen by connecting a consequence to it. When you bump your horse and he speeds up, Stop bumping your heels so that your horse knows that if he does respond to your bumps, that annoying feeling will go away. That learning procedure is operant conditioning, which is often used to sensitize a horse for things that happen, but we'll explain more about that further down the lecture. Just remember that the opposite of habituation is sensitization. Operant conditioning and habituation, or sensitization, just often work together. Normally, habituation is a slow learning process, but it can also be used in an extreme form. Putting a saddle on a green horse and letting him buck around in panic, for instance, is called flooding. The horse simply can't get away from the thing he fears the most, and so he gives up resistance. Now you might think approach and retreat is a novel way of training, invented by horse whisperers, but it's actually old wine in new bags. Gradually exposing a horse to something, without going over the threshold like flooding does, is called systematic desensitization. It's mostly a mix of operant conditioning and habituation, and it has been around like, well, always. Classical conditioning is one of the first discovered learning theories. Surely you heard of Pavlov and his dogs. Pavlov rang a bell before he gave food to the dogs, and after a while the dogs started salivating at hearing the bell already. Now we tend to think that this is of no importance to us, but actually it's one of the most important learning processes that happens during training. Without classical conditioning, you wouldn't be able to connect things that happen in your environment, also called stimuli, to events that follow those stimuli. Classical conditioning helps horses and humans predict the coming of bad things, but also of good things. That's where the word conditioning comes from. It explains the conditions under which certain things can happen. Stimuli can be anything that triggers a behavior. Signals or cues or aids like words, sounds, colors, other behaviors. For instance, if your cell phone rings, without classical conditioning, you wouldn't be able to learn that it means someone is trying to contact you. Luckily we have classical conditioning, so you know right away what to do when your cell phone rings. Classical conditioning helps your horse learn connections between something that he already reacts to and something new that has no meaning for him yet. When that something new that he doesn't know yet always comes right before something that he already automatically reacts to, he'll soon start reacting to that new thing already. Classical conditioning is actually very important for riding. Even the so famed classical seat aids are actually learned as predicting stimuli for hand or leg aids. Some stimuli are easier learned than others. It's evident that when something really jumps out of the environment, you'll learn faster what it means. Things that are logical go faster too. For instance, if you eat something that tastes bad and after a while you get sick, you'll easier connect that foul taste to getting sick and not the song that was on the radio while you were eating. Overshadowing happens when one stimulus is stronger than the other, or more irritating, or louder. It's logical that you respond easier to the stronger cue than the more feeble cue. When two cues are equally strong though, you'll respond to the first one you learned. The first one learned blocks out responding to the newer one. Surely you've seen that happen in your training. When people talk about obedience, what they actually talk about is stimulus control, which most of the time has nothing to do with who's boss, but more with if the horse actually knows what he's supposed to do when a certain stimulus happens, and whether the consequences of doing the right thing are clear and important enough to him. When you put something on cue, you don't just put outside behavior on cue, because every emotion triggers behavior, and every behavior triggers emotion. You also put the emotion that comes with the behavior on cue. That's why when you smell pie, you think back of your grandma, but also about the warm emotions that surround your grandma. The last field of influence we'll talk a bit about is operant conditioning. It's about the consequences of what you do. When you try something and something good happens, you'll do that again. When you do something and something bad happens, chances are that you'll do that less. It's one of the most basic and most obvious principles of learning. We won't get much into operant conditioning principles, but rest assured that when someone says we never punish, he either wants to sell the things he does easier, or doesn't really know what punishment actually is. Punishment, at least in the sense scientists use the word, happens everywhere when behavior happens less and less because of its aversive consequences, where aversive just means that it makes someone feel less than good. Of course, hitting your horse for bad behavior is punishment. But punishment happens even when you just say no at your horse, because he wants to chase another horse away from your carrots. If the horse starts doing that less and less every time you say no to him, his unwanted behavior is being punished by your no. The opposite of punishment is reinforcement, where something good happens when you do something, and consequently you do more of the same. So a horse should work for me, but not for the food. Well, we can't read horses' minds, but we do know that a horse probably doesn't work because you have sweet blue eyes or always smile at him. Of course there exists something like interspecies bonding, and I do believe horses can really like their people, and of course they'll do more for you when you're nice to them. But saying that the horse should do things for you is skipping reality about how you got there in the first place. He does what works for him, and if what you do works for him, then he'll work for that. Now this particular explanation is mostly given by people who believe that giving carrots is a bribe, but using pressure to get what you want isn't coercion. So the horse doesn't work for them either, but because if he doesn't yield for the light pressure, more pressure will come, and he wants to avoid that. So it might look as if the horse works for you, and he might even kinda like you, but as long as you up the pressure to force the horse to do what you want, if he doesn't do it for the light pressure, he does it for the pressure, and not for you. But yielding for pressure is rewarding too. Yes, it is. Taking something away that's aversive, even when it's only slightly annoying to the horse, feels good for the horse, because that annoying feeling goes away. The horse is relieved. So yes, release of pressure reinforces the yielding for pressure. Taking the pressure off feels more comfortable, and that's why you'll hear people say that they reward with comfort. But there are two sides of the coin of working with pressure. To be able to give comfort, you first have to take it away. When can I stop rewarding? Well, never. Behavior that doesn't get rewarded will stop from happening. It'll go on for a while still, but if it doesn't make something better, or at least maintain some status quo, it'll stop. If you hit the light button, but the light doesn't come on, you'll stop hitting the light button eventually. Now sometimes we think that we know why behavior happens, but the motivations to go on doing something always are a mix of several different influences. So even when the first or most prominent reward doesn't come anymore, if there are still enough other factors, the behavior will go on. So basically, you never can stop rewarding. You can change the type of reward though, so that for instance it's not anymore that one immediate carrot slice, but a chance to do something nice soon, or even to get back to be left alone in an hour. It can be weird to hear someone say that ignoring bad behavior might be smarter than punishing it. But the word ignore maybe isn't the right one. It would be better to say you don't react to the unwanted behavior, but you have seen it and you'll do something about it. Maybe the unwanted behavior is being reinforced or rewarded by something that you can control. If you take away that reward, then the behavior will stop. It gets extinct, like the dinosaurs. What you also can do is present the opportunity to do a wanted behavior instead. You divert the horse's idea in something that you do want, and that you will reward instead. That way you don't go into the unwanted behavior either, but you are doing something about it, just not directly reacting to it.
So this is a small overview of some of the most important learning influences on your horse. And of course, it's good to remember that these influences, these learning processes and cognitive and biomechanical influences all happen together at the same time all the time. It's just that in the mix of all influences, some things get more weight than others, or some work with you while others work a bit against you. Horse handling and training is truly a fascinating mix. Now, does this mean that if you don't know all of this, you can't be a good trainer? Of course not. Just like when you do know all of this, it doesn't automatically make you a better trainer either. You still have to feel your way through your daily training. But sometimes that feel escapes us a bit. Sometimes we don't know very well where to start. Then knowing a bit about all of this can help you out. It makes you look at what your horse does in a bit more objective way. It makes it easier sometimes to find explanations and solutions. And it doesn't stop you from loving your horse, on the contrary. It makes you more forgiving and more appreciative about what your horse does do for you against all odds. Horses are remarkable beings and they deserve all our interest in their wondrous green-yellow world.